Greetings, everyone, and thanks for coming to the operator training on today, the 12th. My name is Hannah Hickam. I'm the executive assistant, and I'll be your coach for today. And yeah, let's just dive right in. First up is the Q&A from previous trainings. You can go ahead and start chatting your questions to the chat function, and we will begin to answer those. And I believe Greg is taking the lead on that.
Thanks. Good morning, everyone. Yeah, we will certainly take your questions through chat. Also, if you want to raise your hand, Hannah, I think that will you be able to unmute people to ask questions, or will that be too complicated? Is it just easier to write them in the chat?
I can absolutely unmute folks if they would like to be unmuted. The hand raise function is in the participant box at the bottom right. There's 3 dots. Click on that, and then you can click raise hand.
Thank you. And as a reminder, last time we went over the consultation and contact tab, surface and minerals tab, construction, drilling and waste tab. These are all of the Form 2A, excuse me, land use and soils tab, equipment and flow lines, and of course the submit tab. I did commit to getting the questions and answers from last time out, and I have not got them out today, so I will renew my commitment to getting those out. We did a pretty good job of, you know, kind of keeping track of those as they were flying in at us. And what we will do is, once I just kind of get it cleaned up, I will PDF it and put it in with the trainings from 1.7 on the operator guidance tab on our website. So,
or Greg.
Hi, Jane.
Greg, what about putting the questions in the question portal?
So
you're not going to do that?
I think what I will do is I will put a link in the questions portal. Breaking them out individually, it'll just make that really long when the questions are so focused and some of the answers are very short. So yeah, that was my first plan, and then I thought that's just going to make that really cumbersome. So I think it'll be easier to put a link there, and then it's tied specifically to those things. So we do have our first question, and it's if our units are already spaced and pooled, do we have to go through some sort of formal hearing process again? And Jane, since you're here, I think I'd defer to you on a question like that, unless you want to kick that over to hearings.
Is John there? Well, the answer is no. It's easy. And we're actually going to put together a document that kind of goes through all the different scenarios that we're going to all encounter here with, do I need a 2A? Do I need a DSU? Do I need an OGDP? All of that. But if you have the spacing you need, you don't need to ask for more spacing, but you might need to file a hearing application, which is the oil and gas development plan application. So again, I'm building a guidance document that just has some scenarios. Does that work?
Great, thanks. And how do you request a pre-application consultation with the director? So the pre-application consultations, I would reach out directly to the oil and gas location assessment team. And if there is a, if it's a regionally assigned individual, then contact that individual directly for that area. Otherwise, go through the oil and gas location assessment supervisor. We may, just a heads up, we may change those regional assignments. We're still looking at how we're going to break things down as we move into this whole new world of oil and gas development plan review. So we may not wind up with the same regional assignments that we have now.
All right, I'm not seeing any more hands raised or questions being asked. Do we want to give them a few more minutes, or we also will have a Q&A at the end as well?
Yes, we will.
All right, so let's move on ahead. Just give me a moment to make the transition. Next up is Doug with cultural. Oh, sorry.
Before Doug, I did get a private chat question. Does the oil and gas development application have to go through a formal hearings process? And yes, Rule 303 describes that.
All right. Doug, can we go ahead and check your sound, and I'll get that next presentation up.
Thank you, Hannah. Can you hear me all right?
I can. Thank you very much. Just one moment. All right, there we are. Press on.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. This is Doug Andrews with the Oil and Gas Location Assessment Specialist from Northeast Colorado. Excuse me. Thank you for attending this morning. I hope you find our presentations useful and informative. Before I get started, I want to mention two things to everyone. When I'm speaking publicly, I have a tendency to start speaking really quickly, probably out of a sense of nervousness. So if I start doing that, I apologize and ask your forgiveness in that regard. Secondly, you're probably going to have some questions, some very specific questions, at least I anticipate you will, following our presentations, and we may not be able to give you an answer to them immediately right here in this venue. We may have to take some time to think about them and formulate an answer that is going to be useful for everyone. So in that regard, I would appreciate your patience and understanding if we're not able to give you an answer immediately right now, right here. With that, I will move on. Can you go to the next slide, please, Hannah? So my presentation will cover the cultural and safety setbacks tabs and the water resources tabs. This won't be a super detailed, in-depth presentation of every single data field on those tabs. It's more to highlight some new data fields and some existing data fields that have significantly changed or been revised, and provide a little discussion for those. Next tab, please, Hannah. So I believe this is the third in a series of training sessions on how to fill out the Form 2A. The first one, I believe, was last Tuesday, where Sabrina Trask presented the alternative location analysis tab. And then last Thursday, me and several of my other colleagues presented some of the tabs on the 2A that have some more minor, small changes. So this presentation will include some slides showing the mock-up of the cultural and water resources tab that we have presented to the developers to revise in e-forms, and also some slides with the checklist showing how we have tried to answer some of those data fields in a very high level manner. You can go to the next slide, please, Anna. So again, this slide may be familiar to you. Here is the layout, I guess, or the order of tabs for the new 2A. As you can see, we have a few brand new tabs that we've created or having created. We also are renaming some existing tabs to better capture what we want those tabs to deal with. And we've also moved around or changed the order slightly of the tabs to hopefully help the flow of the 2A in filling out be a little more logical. Can you go to the next slide? Okay. So let's get started excuse me, with the cultural and safety setbacks tab. For my presentation, I have highlighted, you'll see that every single data field has a number on it. And this is part of the checklist that we're going to preparing for you guys. And for my presentation, I've highlighted in yellow all the data fields that are either brand new or some existing data fields that have some significant changes and revisions to them. So you can see on this tab that with the current 2A, we would ask that you provide us the distance to the various cultural features from the nearest well and the nearest production facility. Well, that's no longer going to be the case anymore. The new rules do not have the rules concerning designated setback locations that kind of drove the requirement to have distances from the nearest well and nearest production facility. New rules just now talk about providing distance to the nearest cultural features from the edge of the working pad surface. So with those two columns of cultural distances have now changed, and we have one column for distance to the cultural features from the edge of the working pad surface and the direction to those same cultural features. That you providing us the direction makes it easier for OGLA staff when we're reviewing the 2A to verify and locate these cultural features on various different maps that either are provided on the 2A or maybe some aerial photographs, Google Maps, Google Earth, our COGCC, things like that. You may also notice that there are some new cultural features in this list. For example, we now have changed building unit to residential building unit. We have a specific definition for residential building unit. You'll also see at the bottom, there are two new cultural features: disproportionately impacted community and residential building unit, high occupancy building unit, or school facility within a disproportionately impacted community within 2,000 feet of the working pad surface. That's a mouthful right there. So those are new. You all should be familiar with how to, determine the distance to these cultural features. You've been doing this literally since 2009 with the 2A. So the process of that is the same. We've just added, like I said, two new cultural features and made a little specification there on the residential building unit direction. It should be fairly straightforward, I would think, for you guys to determine the direction to that. An important thing to remember is that the distance and direction you provide on this tab needs to agree with what you have shown on your location and layout drawings. This is one of the common, I won't say errors, but misses on QAQC, where we get a location drawing that has distances and direction to some of these cultural features that don't agree with what's on the tab. Again, with these distances, we're looking for you to tell us how far, if any of these cultural features exist out to 1 mile. If they don't exist, if there's not, for example, a designated outside activity area within 1 mile of the edge of the working pad surface, again, like you've always done in the past, we've asked you just put 5280. That tells us that it's nothing within 1 mile. Along with that, after they give those distances and directions, you'll see in data fields 26 through 41, these are brand new data fields. And these are data fields that are driven by Rule 604B. And these have, if you read those rules, and you need to read those rules and make yourself very familiar with them, those are some very specific qualifiers that you may need to undertake if some of these cultural features, specifically residential building units, high occupancy building units, and then the residential building unit, high occupancy building unit, or school facility within a DI community, you have those things. You may need to check some of these boxes. Hannah, would you go forward? Let's see, a couple of slides, one more. Right there. So here is the checklist. Again, I've highlighted some of the data fields for some of those data fields on the corresponding mock-up in yellow, so you can see them, where we talk about, give you some basic information on how do you know when to check those boxes for each one of those particular cultural features. So can you go back up to that slide I was working on, up to slide 5? So those data fields 26 through 41 are brand new and are very important when you have those 3 particular cultural features that are less than, I believe, 2,000 feet. And that's going to have some big drivers in the completion of the Form 2A and some additional requirements that you may need to do on your behalf. So please read Rule 604B. Make yourself familiar with those rules. Please be careful when you're filling out these data fields on this cultural tab. It's very important this information is done correctly. This have large bearing on the processing of your Form 2A. Can you go to the next slide, please, Hannah? So after you, at the bottom, this slide is what would be appeared below on the culturals tab, right below what I just talked about. I couldn't fit it all on one slide. So this will just be just below it. You'll notice, like I said, we don't have the whole designated setback location questions anymore. You know, the ones about, are you in a buffer zone, exception zone? Did you send off your pre-application notice? Is it a LUMA facility? You know, give us your citing rationale. That's gone. It's no longer there because those rules are gone. So now we've included this section in its place. Here in data field number 42, you can see this is where you tell us if you're requesting an exception location. I think previously it was done through the Form 2 APD, but going forward now, this will be done on the Form 2A. So this is just a checkbox with a very explicit description saying if you're wanting to do this, a well less than 150 feet from a property line, please check this box and provide that request letter and waiver on the 2A. So that's no longer on the 2, that's on the 2A now. And below that, we have this grid of boxes, and this is where you tell us the actual count of building units, residential building units, high occupancy building units, school properties, school facilities, and designated outside activity areas between 0 and 500 feet, 501 to 1,000 feet, 1,001 to 2,000 feet. This is explicitly required per Rule 304B, 3B, as you can see immediately to the right. It references that rule and gives some instructions. Here's something, excuse me, to be aware of when you're filling this out. You'll see on here in this little count, this grid of where you give us the count, there's just building units. Or above on the cultural set, they tell you you didn't see building units, you just saw residential building units. So this is where building units is kind of showing up now on the cultural tab. And here's a little nuance that you need to be aware of. Building units are the standard building units that our definition has always had since the setback rules went in place in 2013. It's residences, commercial office spaces greater than 5,000 square feet, warehouse space greater than 15,000 feet. It's the same thing as building units have always been since we've had that definition. That's what building units are. Residential building units obviously are a subset of those. It's just residences. So it is possible to have a scenario such as, for example, say between 500 and 1,000 feet, there are a total of 10 building units. 9 of them are homes. 1 of them is a commercial office space that's 7,000 square feet. So the total number of building units between 501 and 1,000 feet would be 10. For residential building units between 501 and 1,000 feet, it would be 9 because there are 9 homes. So on the surface, it will look like there are a whole lot more building units out there than there really are, but it's just that we are parsing out residential building units, a count of residential building units within these distances from all building units. So please be aware of that distinction there when you're filling that out. The same thing could occur for high occupancy building units. It's possible that you may have a high occupancy building unit that falls within that subset and needs to be split out. Okay, so that's something to be careful of when you're filling out this data grid. Next slide, please, Hannah. Here is the example of the checklist with some of those data fields highlighted. Let me scroll down here. Yeah, just so you get an idea of the information we're providing. This shows some basic information on how to fill out the part where we talk about disproportionately impacted communities on the form on this tab. Next slide, please, Hannah. Again, this is the, whoops, I'm sorry, I'm trying to go along here at the same time on a different screen. In this slide shows what I just talked about, where you have those 604B1 rules that require you to indicate to us if these scenarios are being met via check boxes. Next slide, please, Hannah. And then here are, again, the checklist for that grid that shows the count of the different various cultural features within those subset of distances. This is kind of what the checklist is going to look like. It's not going to go in super depth on every single data field. It's designed to be a kind of a high level thing to get you started on how to fill out each one of these data fields. So that is pretty much what I wanted to present on the Cultural and Safety Setbacks tab. Let's move on to the Water Resources tab now. Next slide, please, Anna. This tab has also undergone some significant changes. It has quite a few new data fields. We've also moved around the order of some of the existing data fields. We've done all this in an effort to help you better determine if your location is in a sensitive area due to the water resources and potential impacts to them. So again, like the cultural tab, here's a mock-up of what we presented to the developers on how to change the Form 2A for this tab. And I've highlighted those data fields that have either brand new or significant changes. And the first part of the Water Resources tab is now where you provide us information on groundwater and water wells. So similar to the cultural tab, we're asking now for both the distance and direction to not only water wells, the nearest water well like we always have, but we've also added a spring or seep. We wanted to know where the nearest one of those is. Again, if there isn't one within a mile, just put 5280. The direction at that point really won't matter. If there's no spring or seep within a mile, just put 5280. The direction really doesn't matter at that point because it's beyond that. I mean, if you know the direction, you happen to know it's 7,000 feet away, you still put 5280. And if you know it's to the northwest, you can put northwest down. That's fine. But if you don't have one within a mile, you don't need to find the nearest one regardless of where it is. So that's the groundwater section. Well, that's the first part of the groundwater section. And then after that, we have the question, estimated depth to shallowest groundwater that we can encounter at this oil and gas location. Again, very similar to the question that was on the existing Water Resources tab, but I wanted to talk about this. And talk about this a little bit more to help you guys get this question right. What we want to know here, and this is why we've added the word shallowest to this question. We want to know how shallow groundwater is likely to be at your location because it gives us an idea of the likelihood of impact to groundwater if there's a spill or release from either surface equipment or some of your like pipelines or things like that run through the site. We want to know how shallow the groundwater is. So to determine that, primary way of determining that, short of literally drilling a monitoring well on your location and figuring out where it is to use some existing water well data that's out there. As you well aware, we have a water wells layer on our COGCC map tool that is a data source that we have taken from the Division of Water Resources. However, that data source is sometimes not as complete and detailed as we would all like. For example, it will show every water well that has been permitted through that agency as a little blue dot on our map. However, it may be that blue dot represents a water well where a permit was submitted to DWR, but the water well was never drilled. Or the blue dot may represent a water well that was permitted, was drilled, and now has been abandoned. Okay. It also may represent a water well where the location accuracy of that well is not very precise. At the time the permit was submitted, the accuracy may have been only it's in this section 26, or it may be the accuracy is the well is in the northwest quarter of section 26. So when that happens, that blue dot just kind of shows up in the center of the section or the center of the quarter section. That doesn't necessarily mean that is exactly where that water well is. You need to go into that permit and review all the data in there to determine exactly if where that blue dot is showing up on our COGCC map is where it really is. Because that blue dot is only as good as the data that we get from DWR. And that's only as good as the permit that was filled out and submitted to DWR. And sometimes these old wells, the permit requirements were not nearly as detailed as they are now. So be careful with determining where the distance and direction to the nearest water well is, just going solely on where those blue dots show up on that on our COGCC maps. Okay, you need to root into that permit and look through all the different files and documents in that permit to determine if that blue dot is accurately placed. You may also need to use aerial images from like Google Earth or the aerial photos on our COGCC map to help you see some of these, where these water wells are. If it's a stock well with a little stock tank, you can see those on aerial images, and sometimes they don't line up on the aerial image exactly where that blue dot is. Sometimes topographic maps will show a little symbol for a water well, and they won't line up exactly where that blue dot is. So use those tools to help you determine exactly where these water wells are in relationship to your location, so you can accurately give us the distance and direction. And it may require, and we highly recommend, that you field verify the nearest water well as best you can. It may be on property that you don't have access to, so you can't really dial it in the exact distance down to maybe the foot or so, but you can probably you may be able to get a whole lot better distance to that well, field verifying it as best you can, than just relying on the blue dot on the water well layer on COGCC maps. So please, when you're filling out this section, open up those water well permits, look through them, read the information in them to help you determine exactly how far away and what direction it is. Use that information on the permit along with aerial images and topographic maps. That permit information will also give you good information, on determining the depth to the shallowest groundwater. Sometimes those water well permits don't provide any information on depth to groundwater. Sometimes they do. Sometimes the water well may be someone's drinking water well, and they've drilled it way down into a deep aquifer, say 400 or 500 feet, and they've only screened it from say 300 to 500 feet, and then they've listed a depth of water, a static water level of 270 feet. Is that indicative of how shallow groundwater is at your location or in that immediate area? Maybe not, probably not, especially if you've got surface water features nearby to your location, some streams or creeks or wetlands or springs and seeps. Those are indicative of much more shallower groundwater. So just because the nearest water well lists a depth to water, it may not be representative of the shallowest groundwater that is present in that area. It may require you to look at several different nearby water well permits. Look to see where the well, how deep the well was drilled, where the well was cased and screened. If there's any kind of boring log or lithologic log, you may need to look through that and see where, if they have any notation about where water was first encountered when they were drilling that water well. The whole idea of this is to try to find out how shallow groundwater is out of this location, so that you and us will have an idea of the likelihood of impacts from possible spills and releases. So that's what you should do when you're estimating the depth of shallowest groundwater. That's data field number 6. Data field number 7 is that text box where you can tell us how you arrived at that estimated depth. This is also where, if you have a water well that you're using to estimate the depth of groundwater and it's at a significantly different elevation from your pad, say your pad is being proposed up on a bluff and the nearest water well that you're using to determine your groundwater depth is down close to a drainage, and there's a good 50 feet in difference in elevation. Well, of course, the groundwater is going to be encountered in that well that's drilled down in that low drainage sooner than if a water well was drilled up on top of the bluff. So this is where you can tell us we've had to do a little bit of calculations to account for that difference in elevation. And again, this text box is where you would show that, nearest water well shows a static water level of 20 feet, but there's 50 feet difference in elevation between that well and our location. Therefore, we estimate the depth of water is approximately 70 feet, something to that effect. All right, hopefully this is useful information for you on how to come up with the depth of groundwater and how to demonstrate how you did that through data fields 6 and 7. Following that, we have a section on surface water and wetlands. And here we have some revised questions that have some very specific terminology in them. Data field 9 and 10 is the distance and direction to the nearest down gradient waters of the state. That's a little change to that question that's on the water resources tab is now. We have a definition in our 100 series about waters of the state and what compromises that. Please review that definition to get a better understanding of what we mean by waters of the state when you're giving us that distance and direction. If, in data field 11, if there's a water of the state that is less than a half a mile, you need to determine if is within 15 stream miles upstream of a public water system intake. Then if yes, you have to attach some additional things. So this is just an NA, a yes or no question. Obviously, if you have no waters of the state within a half a mile of your location, the answer will be NA. But here is where you will need to possibly figure out how far away that surface water is upstream of a PWS intake if it's within 15 miles. This is going to take some extra effort on your part, but this is being driven by some of the new rules. Okay, next slide, please, Hannah. Again, following on the surface water section, we have a question where we ask the distance and direction to down gradient wetlands. On the 2A now as it exists, that analogous question was talking about riparian areas. Well, that's very specific subset. We want to be a little more inclusive of things, so we changed that to wetlands. We don't want to just focus on riparian areas. We want to focus on distance and direction to all wetlands. Okay, we have a layer on our COGCC map, a wetlands inventory map layer that we, again, it's a data source. It's not our personal data source that we went out and collected and did ourselves in the field. We taken this data source from, I believe, the feds. So you can use that tool to help you determine that. But also, just like with the water wells, you should really go out and field verify the nearest distance and direction to the nearest wetland. Because sometimes those things don't show up on that little wetlands inventory layer map. And it takes you an actual trip out in the field to make that determination. So please do that. Don't rely on just a strict desktop review to make this determination. Data field 14 provide a description of the nearest down gradient surface waters of the state. Again, the checklist will have some brief discussion on what we mean on that. We just want to know, basically, is it a river, creek, stream, pond, reservoir, or wetland? Does it have a name? It's, Milton Reservoir, it's the Colorado River, something like that. If you can determine what it's actually being used for, drinking water source, or, one of its also uses may be one of those gold medal streams. We want to know that information. Again, this is information that's useful in helping you and us determine if your location is in a sensitive area for water resources. Moving on to data fields 15, 16, and 17. These are brand new data fields that are being driven by Rule 411. These are when your location is within a surface water supply area, a certain distance of a surface water supply area, or a Goody type 3 well. And then There's buffer zones in there that's like internal, intermediate, and external. This is similar in question to what was currently on the water resources tab when it talks about public water systems in the buffer zone. You may be in for that, but this rule 411 goes into specifics about exactly what we want you to look for. That rule 411, it's a big rule. There's a lot there, and it goes into quite a bit of detail about surface water supply areas and GUDI type 3 wells. You need to read that rule 411A, 411, all of rule 411 very carefully several times to get an understanding of what this rule is about and what the requirements of that rule are, so that you can correctly identify if your location falls within one of those buffer zones. Because again, if it does, that will have some significant bearing on what you will need to do to get your permit approved by us. There's significantly more requirements when you have one of these scenarios. Okay. Data fields 17 and 18 is where we talk about the Army Corps of Engineers Section 404 permit. I believe on the current 2A in the water resources section, that question just basically says, has a Corps of Engineers Section 404 permit been filed? Yes, no. And that was a troubling question for us, because if you answered no, it hasn't been filed, that never really told us, should you have filed one? So we changed that question to be a little more explicit in telling us, do you need to have a Section 404 permit with the Corps of Engineers? Along with that, that doesn't just include your oil and gas location, and it also includes if you need a permit because your access road that you're going to build will require it, or your associated pipeline corridor. So it's not just the pad itself, it's also your access road or associated pipeline corridor. You may need to confer with the Corps of Engineers to make this determination. And if you have determined that you need to file a 404 permit, or you already have one in place, data field 18 is where you basically tell us the permit status of that 404 permit and its number if you have that available. Okay, so this question is kind of to parse out a little more fully that original question on the 2A about that subject, because it was too limited, and it always led to us kind of having to do follow-up questions when we were unsure of that your answer was correct, because we just didn't ask for enough information from you to determine that sometimes based on what we saw on our review. So that's why we kind of filled out that whole concept there. Well, after that, you'll see the standard familiar floodplains question. That's still in play. That's pretty much unchanged. And then finally, at the very bottom of the water resources tab, you will see the question about, does this proposed oil and gas location lie within a sensitive area for water resources as defined in our 100 series rules? On the current water resources tab, this was the very first question asked. And staff really didn't like that question coming first. We thought it was better to this be the last question asked, because we want you to take all the information that you've presented on this tab, along with your hydrology map and the definition for sensitive area in our rules, and use all of that information together to answer this question. So therefore, that's why we want to move this question to the bottom of the water resources, because instead of the first, to help lead you to this answer much more easier than filling in everything and then having to go back to the top of this tab and then answering it. So that's why that question is moved to the bottom of this tab. Can you go to the next slide, please, Hannah? So again, here's a little screenshot from the checklist that shows, how do you get it right for distance and direction to springs or steeps, estimating the depth of the shallowest groundwater. You see it's got a couple of bullet items. I tried to be as concise and pithy as possible in doing this. But these are kind of nuanced questions we're asking, and the answer isn't always straightforward. So hopefully this checklist will help you with that, and my presentation discussion is helping you with that, understand that. Next slide, please, Hannah. Again, here's the checklist on how to answer the question about distance and direction to the nearest downgradient surface water of the state. And when if that is within a half mile, is that surface water with 15 miles upstream of a public water system intake? Some brief answers on how to get that right to help you understand the concept of what we're getting at there. Kind of highlighted those particular cells or data field answers. You can read those for yourselves. I'm sure, again, reading all these, how do you get it right? It's probably going to generate a lot of questions. That's great. That's fine. It may be that we need to prepare a separate external guidance document on the whole water resources concept to fully flesh out some of these things. Maybe that's the case. We'll see. Next slide, please, Ham. Again, some more of the checklist answers for data fields 14 through 18. Again, tried to provide enough information to give you an idea of what's expected and to get you started on the right track. It isn't designed to cover every possible scenario. Colorado's a big state, and there's a whole bunch of different variables in all of this. And you guys are going to have specific questions based on your specific scenarios for specific locations. So that may require you to contact the OGLA staff to discuss your specifics when filling out these data fields on the water resource tab and other data fields on other tabs as well. Again, there's some basic ideas on how do you get this right for those particular questions. Again, the checklist will be filled out for every data field on every tab. I'm just showing you little screenshots of particular ones that I'm talking about in my presentation. And I believe next slide, Hannah, that is it. My presentation on those two slides. I believe now we can hand this off to Stephen Schwartz. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Doug. Great job. Just give me a moment, folks, to make that transition, and I'll get that all going.
And I'll second that. Thank you, Doug, and great job.
Sorry to interrupt. I think before we switch over to Stephen, since we did get a lot of questions for Doug, let's go ahead and sort of start running through those questions if we could. The location assessment team has been madly trying to cover those questions, and I think that might be more timely to do those now. So I'm going to go back to the first question that we didn't answer prior to Doug starting, and that question was, will the use of a priority list continue? And the practice of submitting a monthly permitting priority list will not continue. COGCC staff will no longer use lists from the operators to prioritize the review of Form 2As and the associated oil and gas development plans, or Form 2s. COGCC will initiate review for completeness of forms in the order they are received, and COGCC will conduct technical review generally in the order the forms pass completeness. The next question, when will the regional assignments be publicized regarding the OGLA team? I mentioned that there may be some changes to those assignments. There haven't been changes yet, so all contact information is available on our website under Contact Us, and there are maps of regional assignments. If those assignments change, they will be posted there. And then a question that was kind of answered as Doug was going along. Will 5280 still be acceptable response if these features are not located within a 1 mile of the proposed working pad surface? That's on the cultural distances, cultural and safety setbacks tab. And typically, yes, that is appropriate. There may be some times where we ask for clarification of something beyond that, but that would be the exception, not the rule. Is there a layer with DI communities on COGCC maps? currently, no. But our GIS team of one, Chris Eisinger, is working on getting that layer built and added to our COGCC maps this week, hopefully. We hope to have it launched by Friday. If the map isn't ready on Friday, operators can find information online via the US Census Bureau, ACS data, and EPA's Environmental Justice and Screening Mapping tool. And so there's several GIS layers available for free from the US Census and ACS website. And we will have those links available when we post this document, the question and answers document today. And let's see. Yeah, there's information about tools to help you find information about census block groups and data tables, and there's interactive tools there. For the hydrology map attachment, do permit issued status wells need to be shown, or only the constructed status wells? The hydrology map is intended to show locations of actual water wells. So permit issued should be considered, and the operator should evaluate whether it may have been constructed, but follow-up paperwork was maybe not filed. So if there's an obvious well on the ground or in an aerial photo, even though it doesn't say constructed, we should still consider that as being constructed. And in that case, it should be identified as existing. If it's a 1975 permit and it says permit issued and there's nothing there in the middle of a barren field, then that doesn't need to be considered. Please elaborate on springs and seeps, on how to find springs and seeps. So known springs and seeps are typically shown on USGS quad maps, and those are available on our website as well. There is a map layer there. However, unmapped springs and seeps may exist, and these should also be identified on your hydrology map. These may be found by an aerial photograph review. They may be found by interviewing landowners or ranchers who typically know where the water is. They may be found through surrounding land reconnaissance. In some cases, those springs and seeps are required to be sampled periodically by operators in the area. A follow-up question to that: if there is a spring or seep shown on a topographic map, but we want to check it on the ground and it is presently dry, do you still want the distance and direction to that dry spring? And I would say yes. You know, because if it shows up on a topo map and it's not on your hydrology map, then we will follow up with a question to you, and that will slow down your permit review. So unless you demonstrate that it's permanently dried or destroyed, you should include it on your map. You can add a note to describe that it's dry, like according to the landowner, the spring has been dried up since 1974. But a spring that dries up in one drought year may show back up and reemerge in a normal or wet year. So we don't want them just dropping off unless it can be verified. A question was asked, is there a definition for a stream mile? And a stream mile is just measured along the mapped or actual flow path of the main channel of a stream. And various mapping tools can be used to connect a sinuous series of dots into a measurable line. So that's an exercise that can be done on a map tool, GIS tool. It doesn't need to be surveyed. There was a comment that the current 400 series rules only shows through rule 405. I did post a link in the chat to answer that. The rules are complete on our website. They do take a little bit to load. So if you just click on them and then scroll down, you may not find what you're looking for right away. Can you clarify whether or not the 404 disclosure requirements only apply to the operator filing the Form 2A and not a third-party midstream that may have a 404 permit downstream of the location. I'm going to somewhat defer that question and get a little more detail. Generally, I would say yes, it does only apply to the oil and gas location. However, if they are off-location flow lines that are, necessary for the construction and operation of the pad, then it should be noted on the Form 2A that 404 permit is required for those and has been sought through the Army Corps of Engineers. Is there a required wetland determination protocol? Yes, follow the wetland determination protocol provided by U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So begin with a desktop review, including information provided by the National Wetland Inventory maps, which are included as a map layer on the COGCC maps. Topo maps, aerial photographs would all be considered. And then, obviously to determine wetlands, you'd be looking at hydric soils, hydric vegetations, wetland hydrology, and making that determination based on all of the information available. For the purposes of the COGCC requirements, the hydraulic connectivity to a jurisdictional water of the U.S. is not necessarily a criteria that must be met. We'd be looking to protect isolated wetlands as well as those directly associated with surface water of the state. Is the oil and gas development plan the same thing as a Form 2A? No, those are described in Rules 303 and 304. And the oil and gas development plan is the application that is submitted for the commission to consider. And the oil and gas development plan may include multiple Form 2As for well site locations, production facility locations, and may describe a larger area. And an individual Form 2A is still required for each oil and gas location that's to be considered under the oil and gas development plan. But the oil and gas development plan is the overall process that will take an application to the commission hearing for approval. We got a suggestion to create a hover feature over the rules that will show rule language or a guidance link. And so I'm thinking that's embedded in the eForms various tabs. Currently, we are still operating on the Microsoft Silverlight platform, which is no longer supported by Microsoft. And so we probably will not include that functionality within the form, but perhaps when we are able to update the forms to web forms, instructions or rule links could be embedded in it. What is the difference between waters of the US and waters of the state? Generally speaking, waters of the state will include all waters within the boundaries of Colorado, including isolated wetlands and groundwater. Waters of the US are defined specifically by US EPA. I believe there are some ongoing disputes of what are and are not waters of the US, so I'm not going to comment on that, but waters of the state are defined in COGCC rules. Let's see. With regard to wetlands and ALA, now I'm getting ahead of myself. There are several plans that were requested. Does this need to be a document that gets uploaded, or is it a fill-in on the Form 2A? We will get to that momentarily because that's going to be the topic of Stephen's presentation. So we'll actually kind of put that one on pause. And then there's one other question with regard, oh, nope, they're still coming in. With regard to wetlands and alternative location assessment, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm now at the end of the answers that I've got pre-prepared. So we're going to turn it over to Stephen, and Aaron, we will get to your question after Stephen does his presentation, and same with John P. We will work through your question after Stephen works through his presentation. So thanks you guys for the questions. Keep chatting them in. It's really helpful to give us a chance to work through them and get references and whatnot in there. So thank you.
Thank you, Greg. All right, next up is Stephen Schwartz. And Stephen, can we just check your sound real quick?
Yes, I think today my mic won't be brushing against my collar.
Oh, okay, awesome. Thank you so much. Take it away.
Absolutely. And thank you, Greg, for dealing with all those rapid fire questions and everyone behind the scenes answering. Today, I'm going to be talking about the new plans tab and the changes that have occurred to the variances and exemptions tab. Next slide, please, Hannah. So the plans tab, like I said, is a brand new tab. The variances and exemptions tab includes some of what was the variances and exceptions, but it includes a new section regarding exemptions. And in this discussion, I'm also going to go over lesser impact area exemption requests, which come in as an attachment, as well as touch on the topic that is also covered during completeness, which is substantially equivalent information. Next slide, please, Hannah. Here's where the plans and the variances and exemption tabs sit in the order of the tabs on the top in eForms. And these are the two that I'm focusing on today. Next tab, please. Next slide. So because there are so many plans required by the new rules, we wanted to create a separate tab just for them to prevent cluttering in the attachments tab. Here you can see that they're aligned very simply, vertically in order, the same order that they are in the rules. Go to the next tab, please. Next slide, please, Hannah. And you can see for all of them, there is a plan upload button. So you will select the plan upload button and upload that specific plan in line with its given number and description. Next slide, please, Hannah. And so this is what it will look like after your plans are uploaded. If it's been successfully uploaded, a second button will appear that is the View Plan button. And that is what we as reviewers will be clicking on to open the document during our review in eForms. Also, as you can see here, if a plan is not uploaded, the area next to the plan upload button will remain blank. Next tab, please. Slide. Here's an example of what the plans tab looks like for the checklist. Here we are including in the how you get it right, we're referencing the different specific other rules that guide some of the description of the content of these different plans, as well as the COGCC plan guidance documents that are soon forthcoming. Overall, this tab is fairly straightforward. You'll be uploading the plans in their different sections. One important note that I'll go into a little more detail a little later in the presentation is if you are seeking a lesser impact area exemption from providing a plan, then the plan may not be uploaded. And that's going to get into the next tab, which is, next slide, please, Hannah. The variances and exemption tab. So the variance section up top should be nearly identical to the old Form 2A, where you would check the box if a variance is being sought, and then list the rules or orders the variance is being sought from. This is largely unchanged, just the rule number was changed slightly. It's this bottom part that's very new. This bottom section is the exemption request section. This refers to Rule 304D that allows operators to make lesser impact area exemption requests. Here, the operator will select all the information or plans or plans they are seeking an exemption from having to provide. In the next few slides, we'll go over what is expected in that lesser impact area exemption request attachment. Next slide, please, Hannah. So here we have the example from the Form 2A checklist. And here you can see the instructions for correctly checking the box for the variance, as well as providing the rules or commission orders that you're seeking a variance from. A special note there, if you're seeking a variance request must be attached. And you can see at the bottom, it goes into very simply, if you're seeking a lesser impact area exemption from a rule or plan, check the box if you are, don't check the box if you are not. And if you are seeking a lesser impact area exemption, the lesser impact area exemption request attachment must be attached. And I'll go into that right now. Next slide, please. So the lesser impact area exemption request is a single attachment that will contain all the lesser impact area exemption requests, and it will be cross-checked with the variances and exemption tab and the plans tab. So please make sure that you're not uploading plans that you are asking for exemptions from, and checking the proper boxes for ones that you are requesting exemptions from. The exemption requests will be in a single long list with the following 4-item format. First, exemption being requested from. This is the single rule that the exemption is being requested from. Next, the resource concern. The resource concern is what the rule is addressing. The next one, exemption circumstance. This is defined by rule as one of 2 choices. It is either the impacted resource or resource concern are not present in the area, or impacts to the resource will be so minimal as to pose no concern. And then the final item is the description. A description will include how the resource is either not present or how the impacts to the resource will be so minimal as to pose no concern. In the next slide, we'll cover an example of what this request may look like. Next slide, please, Hannah. So here is an example that could come from a possible future lesser impact area exemption request document, requesting an exemption from having to provide a hydrogen sulfide drilling plan. Exemption being requested from, and here the Rule 304C15 hydrogen sulfide drilling plan is listed. The resource concern, hydrogen sulfide. The exemption circumstance, the impacted resource is not present. And then the description. Through a search of the COGCC records and from experience drilling in this area, hydrogen sulfide is not anticipated to be present and is therefore not a concern. The operator would then, in the rest of the lesser area impact request document, move on and repeat those 4 items for the next rule they are seeking an exemption from. Rule 304D lesser impact area exemptions are granted during the completeness review. Now, in addition to the Rule 304D lesser impact area exemptions, there's another facet of attachments and plans that is also covered during the completeness review. That is the acceptance of substantially equivalent information. Next slide, please, Hannah. Rule 304E covers substantially equivalent information. It states that the operator may submit substantially equivalent information or plans developed through a local or federal land use or siting process in lieu of providing information or plans required by Rules 304B and 304C. So one question we've been getting is, how are we going to determine this? And here it is. How to submit substantially equivalent information or plans. The document that you're submitting is substantially equivalent must have a cover sheet. That cover sheet will be the first page, and it will list the following. It must state that the information being submitted is substantially equivalent. It must state which local or federal government process it was developed for. It must state how it does not conform to the COGCC rules or guidance, and must briefly describe why it should be accepted as substantially equivalent to the required COGCC information or plan. Next slide, please, Hannah. You will then attach the information or upload the plan on the appropriate tab with the COGCC label that most reasonably approximates the information that is being submitted. For example, if submitting a substantially equivalent facility layout drawing, attach it via the Attachments tab and label it Facility Layout Drawing from the dropdown in the Attachments tab. It must have that cover sheet. It is really important that you are clear and concise and that these cover sheets are on these pieces of information you are submitting as substantially equivalent. This is because when we as the reviewers open up these documents, if we see the cover sheet, we immediately know that the information is being submitted as substantially equivalent, and we should not return the form to draft due to any missing information in the attachment that doesn't meet our rules or guidance. This will allow us to speed up the process of review. Additionally, when we open up a plan or attachment and we see that there's no cover sheet, we'll know that the information or the plan should comply with all COGCC rules and guidance. Next slide, please, Hannah. And like I mentioned a little bit earlier, completeness review is what grants the exemptions and allows the substantially equivalent information to be accepted. While it is the passing of completeness by the director that grants the exemptions and accepts the information or plans as substantially equivalent. Now, a couple caveats there. Requests for exemptions and consideration of information or plans as substantially equivalent may be made. However, not all requests will be granted. If it is determined during the completeness review that an exemption request or use of a substantially equivalent information or plan will not be granted, then the form will be returned to draft for the information or plan to be provided. Consulting with COGCC's staff prior to submittal can prevent forms being returned to draft unnecessarily. And then the other side of the coin, further down the road, just because a request is granted via completeness does not preclude the information from being requested later. Both Rule 301E and Rule 303B3 allow at any time before or after the granting of completeness determination that the director or the commission may request any relevant information necessary and reasonable to make a final determination of approval or denial on an OGDP. While we will do our best working with the director during the completeness review to avoid this, there may be instances down the line where during the commission hearing on OGDP, the commission may stay an OGDP application for a plan or piece of information that had been determined as exempt or substantially equivalent during the completeness review. Or even further back in the process, during the technical review or the director recommendation review, it may be determined that something that had been determined exempt or substantially equivalent actually is required in order to make that recommendation review for approval to move on to the next stages. And with that, next slide, Hannah, and that is the completion of my presentation.
Thank you, Stephen. Great job. And now we're going to take questions, and I believe Greg will lead the charge on that.
Thanks, Hannah. Thanks, Stephen. Terrific job presenting. And I'm not sure if I remembered to say that after Doug's presentation, but also Doug, terrific job presenting. In the background, our team has been working feverishly to get some answers to the questions that have been chatted in. So I will again return to the last question that we didn't answer previously. With regard to wetlands and alternative location analysis, Rule 304B2B Romanet 7 requires an ALA if the location is within the boundaries of or is immediately upgradient from a mapped, visible, or field verified wetland or riparian corridor. Has the distance for immediately upgradient been defined? Not formally within our rules. I would say general rule of thumb might be that if the location is a short distance away and demonstrated through field analysis that a spill on the location would likely impact that wetland, or any offsite flow of sediment, erosion, sedimentation would impact that wetland, then it should be considered immediately upgradient. I don't know if you can throw a rock to it from the edge of the location or what. It may depend on topography as well. Steeper topography, that distance may be reasonably increased to determine what's immediate. So it's somewhat subjective. I would say, take a conservative approach to that. There are several plans that we're requiring and requesting. Oh, and I said that hopefully that question was answered by Stephen's presentation. And so the plans that are requested by rule are generally an attachment to the Form 2A. Is there an expectation to try and field verify all assumed wetlands out to 1 mile from the location? The National Wetlands Inventory can be inaccurate, but may be best for these properties where operator doesn't have access or a surface use agreement. And that's true. In many cases, you won't be able to traipse across the neighbor's land looking for a wetland that was mapped on the National Wetlands Inventory. So in some cases, you'll have to do the best you can. In the event that a potential wetland's not mapped on those, the Wetlands Inventory or USGS topographic maps, review additional resources like aerial photos, especially looking over a period of time to see whether you can see patterns of water standing at the surface in an area, or those vegetation changes that are visible through an aerial photo review. If there are indications that a wetlands may be present, then a field verification certainly may be prudent. If you're unable to access the area, again, a conservative assumption would be appropriate. If the wetland is mapped on the National Wetland Inventory, then a field verification would be appropriate to determine the current extent, as those have probably shrunk over time and may have expanded over time. So I think that covers that. And now I think we're into questions that are directly related to Stephen's presentation. Since the exemption request is one document for multiple items, can we submit a spreadsheet with this information, or does the COGCC prefer a Word format? And of course, all attachments will be submitted as a PDF format. But yeah, a list that describes that all of the exemptions that are being requested in a spreadsheet format could be appropriate, a Word format. This may be something that as we see them come in, we decide, hey, this works and this doesn't. And so we may clarify exactly what we want to see on that later. Should lesser impact area exemption requests be formatted as a letter to the director or more of a narrative style document? And I think Stephen's presentation kind of went into this, and we'll formalize that in guidance that will be available very soon, but is not finalized yet. It doesn't need to be a letter format addressed to the director. The lesser impact exemption can be in a spreadsheet format, a Word format. It should, again, PDF'd. It should respond to the 4 questions for each exemption requested. What rule is the exemption from? What is the resource of concern? Whether the resource is present or whether the resource is present or the exemption circumstance, and then a description of the situation and how the operator or applicant came to that conclusion. Is there a formal form for requesting the pending Form 2As and 2s that the operator requests to keep, which should be submitted by March 1st, 2021? So no, there is not a formal form. I will say stay tuned. On Thursday, we are going to describe this process, I believe. And Jane, are you available to jump in on that one, or do you want to just leave it till Thursday?
Thursday, please.
Okay, super. Thank you. So thanks for your patience on that. You will get detailed information on that on Thursday. And then, are there any rule changes that designate an operator to a unit after they drill a well in that unit? And that's not in my department. So Jane, do you have a thought on that?
Well, most orders of the commission creating a drilling and spacing unit do not convey operatorship. What a spacing order does is it sets the conditions for any development of a particular geologic formation on those lands. So any operator or any entity who has a mineral interest in the spaced lands and wishes to develop the spaced formation has to do it in accordance with that order of the commission. So I hope that answers your question.
Thanks. And then it looks like we've got another question regarding the substantially equivalent information. If an approved local government permit with its supporting documentation is being submitted, may the cover sheet be submitted as the reference page numbers of the appropriate substantial equivalent, or does it need to be broken up for each item seeking a substantial equivalent? I believe it would be appropriate to show that in a cover letter, have that document attached only once. That we may clarify that a little bit further, though, just to make sure structurally that answer works with our forms. But I think that makes the most sense, that you would submit a cover sheet that says where to find everything. Not seeing any more come in. Hannah, is anyone chatting you privately, or are any hands raised? Here's one that came in. Can we obtain a Form 2A and a Form 2 without oil and gas development plan and cumulative impacts? I think the rules are pretty clear on that. And no, a Form 2A is submitted with an oil and gas development plan for development. And a Form 2 then will come in after the oil and gas development plan and the Form 2As are approved by the commission. And then the Form 2 will come in and is administratively approved, provided that it meets the requirements of the rules and is consistent with the oil and gas development plan and Form 2As that were approved. And Jane would like to add to that.
So on Thursday of this week at the training on Thursday morning, we will go through some or provide some scenarios to help everyone understand when a 2A is required, when a drilling and spacing unit is required, when an OGDP applications required. And that might help with that question.
Thanks, Jane.
And Greg, I don't have any hands raised.
All right. Well, again, feel free to put questions into the question tool on our mission change guidance page. And we are, furiously trying to get answers out to that as well. Although I did notice that there are some blanks, and I think some of those are assigned to me. So maybe I'll get some free time here today to dig into some of those questions. So thanks all for your participation today. Thanks to Doug and Stephen for great presentations. And thanks for putting that link in the chat, Hannah. And if anybody else wants to sign off, then I think we're set.
Yeah, I've just put up the next operator training agenda here. I'll send that out and hopefully soon, shortly. You can screen grab that if you want to, or you can just wait for the email. And then, I think we're going to wrap up. Thank you, everybody, so much for attending, and I hope you have a great day. Meeting for all.